President Trump hinted that the regime in Cuba would soon change within this year. At the same time, he increased the pressure on the Cuban regime. He openly said that similar changes would happen in Cuba just like in Venezuela. It seems that after Venezuela and Iran, the next target is effectively Cuba. Let's take a closer look at this today. Let's get right into it. President Trump, during a media interview during the war with Iran, stated that he expects similar changes to happen soon in Cuba as in Venezuela. Cuba had relied on oil and medical aid from Venezuela, but after the US ousted President Maduro, all support stopped, plunging Cuba into a national crisis. President Trump mentioned this and said he could bring about regime change. On March 7th local time, President Trump launched an alliance with Central and South American countries to combat criminal cartels in the Americas. President Trump clearly stated he plans to use the US military to eliminate criminal organizations in Central and South America, showing his intent to establish military control over the continent. President Trump said the US military could be deployed immediately against cartels if their locations are provided. He made these comments during the war with Iran, emphasizing near-hegemonic leadership in the Western Hemisphere aims to appease core supporters protesting that US Middle East intervention violated America First and national interest. The Trump administration's main foreign policy is to boost US dominance in the Western Hemisphere and block outside interference. The Trump administration's foreign policy focused on minimal interference outside the Western Hemisphere, but attacking Iran has somewhat undermined that principle. So it seems that these actions are being taken to ease that situation a bit. However, unlike this, Cuba is actually on the brink of collapse. It's to the extent that Cuba could even go so far as to declare a wartime footing. According to a report by AFP, Cuban state media said that President Miguel Diaz-Canel personally presided over a meeting of the National Defense Council. At this meeting, various plans and measures for transitioning the country to a wartime system were reportedly reviewed and approved. This announcement is being interpreted as a sign that the Cuban government is considering the possibility of a military conflict with the United States. However, given the current situation, it is difficult to say that Cuba is actually preparing for war. Rather, it seems more like a political message aimed at overcoming the extreme economic crisis. Right now, Cuba's economic situation is very serious. Power shortages and fuel shortages have become routine, and even the industrial and transportation systems are being disrupted. In this situation, analysts say that the government's move to shift the country into a wartime state is mainly aimed at strengthening internal unity and managing the crisis. To understand this situation, we need to look at the recent events in Venezuela as well. The United States applied military pressure on Venezuela, and there was an incident where President Nicolas Maduro was arrested and extradited to the United States. This incident appears to have been received as a significant shock by the Cuban government. From Cuba's perspective, Venezuela is one of the few leftist allies and a key partner on which it is economically dependent. President Maduro being handed over to the United States within hours inevitably feels like a direct threat to the Cuban regime. Especially in terms of energy issues, Venezuela has been like a lifeline for Cuba. This relationship was not established recently, but has been a long-standing arrangement dating back to former President Hugo Chavez. At that time, the Chavez government supplied oil to Cuba at prices much lower than the international market, thanks to its large production capacity. This supply arrangement was more than economic, it was a strategic partnership to uphold their political alliance and support each other's regimes. Cuba's energy structure shows how critical this issue is, as most of its electricity comes from thermal power generation. This means that if there is a fuel shortage, the operation rate of power plants drops immediately. As power generation decreases, industrial production is also hit at the same time. Factories stop running, and problems occur in logistics and transportation systems as well. Public transportation may be reduced or stopped, impacting essential facilities like hospitals. In fact, Cuba is already experiencing repeated long power outages. In some areas, there are even situations where the power is cut off several times a day. If the oil supplied from Venezuela is cut off like this, the entire Cuban society could be shaken. The power issue affects industries, transportation, and healthcare, so the Cuban government is taking the situation in Venezuela very seriously. With the US directly pressuring Venezuela, growing anxiety in Cuba suggests they may be the next target. Given this context, some interpret that Cuba is signaling a shift to a wartime footing, and it appears there is an effort to cut off all fuel supplies to Cuba. The United States is tightening sanctions on Cuba, with the Trump administration now labeling Cuba a possible national security threat. They've also set grounds to impose tariffs and sanctions on third countries and companies supplying crude or refined oil to Cuba. As a result, the daily crude oil supply, previously about 100,000, 120,000 barrels before 2020, has sharply fallen to around 50,000, 60,000 barrels. Additionally, reduced direct energy supply to Cuba has lowered electricity production. As I mentioned earlier, Cuba relies on thermal power for more than 90% of its electricity generation. Due to fuel shortages, the operating rate of power plants has dropped to about 60 to 70%, and as a result, more areas are experiencing routine rolling blackouts lasting 8 to 12 hours a day. Some analyses predict Cuba's GDP growth rate could drop to -5% by 2026. Additionally, the country depends heavily on tourism. Due to jet fuel shortages, international flights are down about 20-30% from 2025 levels. Around 40% of hotel rooms are vacant. This is a very serious situation, isn't it? In effect, this has led to a blockade of the entire country of Cuba. There is another important reason why the United States is putting such strong pressure on Cuba and implementing policies that are close to a blockade. That reason is the presence of Russia and China. Cuba is geographically close to the United States, just about 150 kilometers from Florida. For the US, it's almost like having an island directly off its own coast. Rival powers like Russia or China expanding influence in this area is highly sensitive for the US. The US views the Cuba issue as more than a diplomatic or ideological dispute. It's a national security concern. In recent years, Russia has been making moves to strengthen its relationship with Cuba again. There has even been mention of possible military cooperation. Russia continues to expand cooperation with Cuba in energy, tourism, and military technology, but is unlikely to set up large-scale military bases like during the Soviet era. However, for the United States, even a symbolic Russian military presence is a very uncomfortable situation. The United States is already competing strategically with Russia in Europe and does not want Russia's influence to grow near home. The same applies to China. China is engaging with Cuba more quietly than Russia, with Chinese companies interested in Cuba's telecommunications, ports, and power grids. Recently, there has been discussion about Chinese investment in Cuba's renewable energy and power grid projects to address its power shortage. These moves may seem like economic cooperation, but the United States sees them differently. Infrastructure investment brings long-term influence. Ports and communication networks serve economic roles in peacetime, but can be used militarily if needed. Thus, the United States views the Cuba issue as part of global strategic competition, not just a regional matter. The United States is pursuing a strategy of keeping Russia in check in Europe and putting pressure on China in the Indo-Pacific. In this situation, there are moves to prevent another strategic foothold from being established in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba is the country located at that very point. Looking at the current situation, it doesn't seem very likely that the United States will immediately use military force to directly pressure Cuba. That's because the United States has little reason to send a carrier strike group to the Caribbean for a show of force or risk conflict. Cuba's strength has already been significantly weakened by decades of economic sanctions and financial blockades. Foreign currency reserves are almost gone, and fuel and food shortages are making life harder for people. In this situation, it seems that simply maintaining the current pressure campaign is effective enough, without having to take the risk of military action. Recently, Cuba's economy has faced a structural crisis. The tourism sector has declined sharply, and limits on foreign remittances have greatly reduced dollar inflow. Power shortages have caused long blackouts in cities, making it hard for factories and transportation to function normally. It has become common for residents to stand in line for hours just to get daily necessities, and many young people are leaving the country in large numbers. With such weakened internal strength, even minor external shocks increasingly threaten regime stability. On top of this, the situation in Venezuela is making things even harder for Cuba. Until now, Cuba has managed to cope with its energy problems to some extent thanks to the crude oil it receives from Venezuela. However, if the Venezuelan regime itself suffers a major blow, this supply chain could also be disrupted at any time. If energy supplies are significantly reduced, the Cuban economy could become unstable at a much faster rate than it is now. If power production decreases, industrial activity will stop, and it will have a major impact on transportation and the medical system as well. If this vicious cycle continues, running the country itself could become extremely difficult. For the United States, observing this trend alone can advance their strategic goals. Without direct action, Cuba's economic and social structures may be disrupted, weakening the regime's stability. That's why the current strategy of blockade and pressure is seen as less costly than military action and has longer-lasting effects. The fact that the United States can avoid criticism for military intervention in the international community is also an important factor. It seems likely that they will continue to pressure Cuba through a blockade rather than military intervention.